My name is Eliza Crowford, and I work as a healthcare compliance auditor in Denver, Colorado. A job built on reading what other people hope no one will notice. At 6 a.m., my phone lit up with an email from the Colorado Medical Licensing Board, marked Emergency Review. A phrase that means your career can be paused before you finish your coffee. The complaint attached to it came from my mother, Judith Crowford, who asked the board to suspend my professional standing on the grounds that I was mentally unfit to work in healthcare. I read the sentence twice. Then a third time, because it is strange how familiar betrayal can feel even when it arrives in a new form. Judith wrote that she feared I posed a risk to vulnerable patients and that my judgment could no longer be trusted. Language that mimicked regulatory phrasing but missed its rhythm. She claimed her concern was maternal and urgent. And somewhere in the attachment, she said, "I'm only trying to protect people before something irreversible happens." My stepfather, Russell Crowford, was listed as a supporting witness. His signature neat and deliberate. The same hand that had always known where to apply pressure. The email header showed the complaint had been uploaded at 5:58 a.m., which told me this had been planned long before dawn. I did not call my mother, and I did not reply to the board beyond confirming receipt, because this was not a misunderstanding that could be clarified with emotion. The notice explained that I was temporarily restricted from participating in active audits until a formal review could be scheduled. A procedural sentence that carries weight when your work depends on clearance. I had spent years documenting other people's fraud with calm precision. And now, my own name sat inside a file folder I could not see. The irony was quiet and sharp. Like a paper cut you notice only after the bleeding starts. I sat at my kitchen table and read the complaint again, paying attention to what it tried to sound like, rather than what it actually said. The words accused me of ethical instability, yet offered no dates, no patience, no incidents that could be verified or refuted. When I whispered, "This isn't about care," the sentence landed heavier than I expected, because the evidence was already there in the email itself. My mother had not come for my reputation as a daughter. She had come for the credential that protected everything else. The complaint itself read like a checklist designed to trigger alarms rather than explain facts, accusing me of exploiting access, manipulating records, and blurring ethical boundaries without naming a single patient or date. Judith framed it as concern, writing that she feared I could bend systems meant to protect the elderly. A phrase that sounded authoritative until you noticed it never identified which system or how. Russell's supporting statement followed, careful and bloodless, asserting that my proximity to healthcare data made me uniquely positioned to cause harm. Together they painted a picture of risk without ever pointing to an act. What struck me was how little the allegations had to do with me as a person and how much they leaned on institutional language meant to unsettle regulators. They referenced compliance thresholds and fiduciary duty in ways that suggested familiarity but lacked the precision those terms demand. At one point, the filing claimed I had unmonitored discretion, a phrase that does not exist in any governing statute I work under. It was meant to sound dangerous, not to be correct. Patrick Lowell submitted the packet on their behalf, and his cover letter promised cooperation while asserting that swift action is necessary to prevent exposure. The word exposure appeared 3 times in 2 pages, each instance vague enough to imply catastrophe without defining it. Reading it, I realized they were not trying to prove misconduct but to provoke procedure. If the board moved first, the damage would already be done. By the end of the attachment, the target became clear. Even if my name was the headline, they were aiming for the machinery that freezes access before questions are asked. The process that favors caution over clarity. Judith's final line claimed she was acting for the integrity of healthcare itself, as if my credential were a loose thread that could unravel the whole fabric. I closed the file knowing the accusation was not personal in the way people expect, but structural, designed to turn safeguards into weapons. The consequences moved faster than the accusations, as they always do when procedure takes precedence over truth. By noon, an internal memo circulated at my firm stating I was temporarily reassigned away from active Medicaid audits pending regulatory review. The wording careful enough to sound neutral while closing every door that mattered. My supervisor called to tell me this was standard and said, "We're not assuming anything." A sentence designed to reassure, while doing the opposite. When I hung up, my calendar was suddenly empty in a way that felt louder than any confrontation. Emails from colleagues slowed to polite check-ins that asked nothing directly and answered even less. Access credentials I had used for years still worked, but only for read-only files. A technical restriction that signals distrust without ever saying the word. The systems I once moved through freely now watched me move, logging every click as if I were a variable instead of a professional. It was the kind of quiet isolation that looks procedural on paper and personal everywhere else. That evening, Miles noticed I was still at the table long after dinner and asked what had happened. His voice careful in a way that made me tense. I told him my license was under review and that it was temporary. And he said, "Is there anything I should know before this gets worse?" Which landed heavier than the question itself. I answered that everything was in the file already, even though neither of us had seen it. He nodded, but the pause before he spoke again carried doubt he did not yet have language for. By the end of the day, the damage was not reputational but operational. A slow suffocation disguised as caution. I had not been accused in a courtroom or fired from my job. Yet my work was already treated as suspect. Judith had not needed proof to interrupt my life. Only the right forms submitted in the right order. I went to bed understanding that the system had done exactly what it was designed to do. And that design was now pointed at me. I started with what I still had access to, pulling referral logs tied to my mother's agency and lining them up against public claims data that no one thinks to cross-check. The first anomaly appeared as repetition. The same patient identifiers linked to multiple equipment requests filed weeks apart through different clinics. Each entry looked compliant on its own. But together they formed a rhythm I recognized. One that doesn't happen by accident. I copied the entries into a spreadsheet and watched the pattern emerge without needing to touch anything else. As I widened the date range, the repetition sharpened into clusters. Identical billing codes surfacing across unrelated providers, always tied back to the same referral source. The amounts varied just enough to avoid automated flags, never exceeding thresholds that trigger instant review, never identical across submissions. I heard myself say, "That's deliberate." Not because I wanted it to be true, but because the spacing told me someone understood the system's tolerances. This wasn't sloppy or desperate. It was calibrated. I traced one patient through 9 months of filings and found 4 separate claims for equipment that would never be prescribed twice, let alone 4 times. The documentation attached to each claim was technically valid, but recycled. The same phrasing repeated with minor edits. The kind that pass cursory review, but collapse under comparison. When I checked the clinic names, I realized none of them shared ownership, which meant coordination rather than coincidence. The spreadsheet filled with color-coded cells that made the story legible at a glance. By the time I finished, the numbers spoke more clearly than any accusation in my mother's complaint. The referrals flowed in one direction, the payments out in another, and the timing lined up too cleanly to dismiss. I saved the file with a neutral name and backed it up twice. Once locally, and once to an external drive I kept unplugged. Whatever Judith had tried to frame as my misconduct was now pointing somewhere else entirely. And it was pointing with precision. The message came through my attorney's intake email, forwarded to me without commentary. A short note from someone named Audrey Lowell asking if I would speak with her privately. She wrote that she had worked with Russell and that she was afraid of what was being done. Ending with, I can't fix it alone, but I can prove it happened. The timing mattered because it arrived less than an hour after I finished mapping the duplicate claims. Close enough to feel connected, rather than coincidental. I replied with a single sentence agreeing to talk and suggested a neutral call. Nothing recorded. Nothing dramatic. When we spoke, Audrey's voice was tight and controlled. The way people sound when they have rehearsed honesty but still fear the cost. She said, "I was told to sign reports I didn't write," and then corrected herself to say she had written them once. The first time, before being asked to reuse them with altered headers. I asked who gave the instruction, and she answered, "Russell," without pause. Then added that Judith had been copied on every follow-up. She described being told it was temporary, that everyone did it, that refusing would make things complicated. Audrey forwarded emails while we were still talking, each one time-stamped and intact, showing edits requested in language that avoided direct commands. One message read, "Adjust phrasing to maintain consistency across partners," followed by a list of clinics that matched the ones in my spreadsheet. She said, "I kept them because I didn't trust how calm they sounded." And that sentence explained more than any affidavit could. The attachments confirmed reuse. The same documents reshaped just enough to pass. By the end of the call, the story no longer rested on inference alone. Audrey said she was willing to testify and asked only that her cooperation be documented properly, not hidden or minimized. I told her I would do nothing without her consent and that the records mattered more than my word. To which she replied, "That's why I reached out to you." When we disconnected, the case stopped being a theory and became a chain with a visible link. I chose not to respond publicly. Not to my mother. Not to the board beyond confirming receipt. And not to anyone who asked for reassurance disguised as curiosity. Silence was not avoidance but compliance with a process that rewards restraint. And every document I touched stayed within its lane. I assembled what I had into a clean package. Timestamps intact. Headers preserved. Nothing annotated or argued. When people expect panic, calm reads like confidence. And I let that assumption stand. The only filing I made was a formal request for a hearing, submitted through counsel with language so plain it bordered on indifferent. It stated that I denied the allegations and requested the opportunity to present evidence. No exhibits attached. No narrative offered. A clerk confirmed receipt and said, "We'll be in touch with a date." A procedural sentence that sounded small and carried weight. From that moment, the timeline belonged to the board, not to whoever had tried to rush it. I stopped checking messages that didn't advance the record and focused on preserving what mattered. Files were backed up in their original formats. Emails exported with metadata. Spreadsheets locked and duplicated. Nothing renamed in ways that could be questioned later. I kept notes only to track sources, not impressions. Because impressions don't survive scrutiny. The work moved forward without me announcing it. Miles asked once if staying quiet was wise, and I told him it was necessary, not strategic. Because strategy implies theater and this required accuracy. He said, "Just don't disappear." And I promised I wouldn't. Even as I withdrew from everything that wasn't essential, each day ended with the same checklist completed and the same inbox unopened. A routine that steadied me. I wasn't preparing a speech or a defense. I was preparing a record that could stand without me. The hearing took place in a conference room in Denver that looked ordinary enough to make people underestimate it. Long tables. Neutral walls. Microphones set just far enough apart to discourage theatrics. Patrick Lowell spoke first, framing the complaint as a precaution and saying, "We're not here to assign blame, only to prevent harm before it happens." A sentence that leaned heavily on fear without naming facts. Judith sat beside him with her hands folded, nodding at the right moments, while Russell kept his gaze fixed forward, as if posture alone could imply credibility. I listened without reacting, because this was not the part where truth needed volume. When Judith was invited to speak, her voice softened as she said she loved her daughter and only wanted to sleep at night knowing patients are safe. She repeated that phrase twice. Safety like a charm she hoped would ward off scrutiny, and said my access made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't fully explain. The board members asked for clarification, and she answered with generalities about pressure and stress, never crossing into anything that could be examined. The absence of specifics hung in the room longer than her words. Dr. Helen Morano leaned forward and asked Patrick to walk the board through the alleged misconduct, step by step, and he complied with a summary that relied on hypotheticals rather than events. She interrupted to ask, "Do you have a single instance to attach this to?" And he admitted they did not. Only concerns inferred from proximity and role. When she turned to me and asked if I wished to respond, I said yes and slid a folder forward without commentary. The sound it made on the table was small and final. I began by explaining how referral pathways work and how billing codes repeat only under specific conditions. Then let the documents speak where I did not. Board members flipped pages in silence as identical phrasing surfaced across claims from unrelated clinics. Dates aligned in patterns that did not require interpretation. I said, "These entries are valid alone and false together," and stopped there, because elaboration would have diluted the point. Dr. Morano asked where the data came from, and I answered. Public claims databases cross-referenced with agency referral logs. Audrey Lowell was called next, and her testimony unfolded without embellishment, as she described being instructed to reuse documentation and adjust headers. She said, "I was told consistency mattered more than accuracy," and produced emails that confirmed her account in neutral language that could not deny itself. Patrick objected once and withdrew it when timestamps were read aloud. Judith did not look at Audrey, and Russell finally shifted in his seat. As the board reviewed the last exhibit, Dr. Morano paused and looked up, her expression changing in a way that felt familiar. She asked if I had assisted on a state audit 4 years earlier, involving improper referrals. And when I confirmed it, she nodded once and said she remembered the work. That audit stood because the documentation was clean, she said. Not to praise, but to place context. Patrick stopped taking notes. The decision came without ceremony. The complaint denied and the temporary restrictions lifted, followed by a referral to the Attorney General's office for further review. Dr. Morano stated that the board could not ignore evidence of coordinated misuse presented under the guise of concern. Judith stared at the table as if waiting for it to offer an explanation she could accept. While Russell's stillness returned, I gathered my papers knowing the confrontation had ended not with raised voices, but with records left exactly where they belonged. The collapse began with paperwork rather than sirens. A written notice from the board stating that the matter had been referred to the Attorney General for further review. The language was restrained, noting potential coordination and misuse without assigning guilt. But it changed the direction of everything that followed. Judith asked Patrick in a low voice, "What does that mean?" And he answered that it meant nothing yet, which was true only in the narrowest sense. Russell said nothing, his silence no longer confident, just calculated. Within days, agencies that had once returned calls began to delay them, and partners who had relied on Judith's referrals started asking for written explanations. I received confirmation that my temporary restrictions were lifted and that my name had been cleared internally. A sentence that closed one door while opening others. I didn't need to push. Miles read the email over my shoulder and said, "So it's over." And I told him it had simply moved. The process does not announce its momentum, it proves it. Judith sent a message asking to talk. writing that things had gotten out of hand and that intentions had been misunderstood. I did not respond, not out of spite, but because everything she could say already existed in documents that no longer belonged to her. Russell attempted to reach Audrey, and when she declined, he left a voicemail saying, "You're making a mistake," which she forwarded without comment. The words sounded empty once they were recorded. By the time the referral agency quietly suspended operations, there was nothing dramatic left to observe. No one raised their voice or demanded explanations that would change the outcome. The system Judith had tried to weaponize had turned, slowly and predictably, toward the facts she could not erase. What fell apart did so without spectacle, held together only as long as no one looked too closely. The formal consequences arrived in stages, each one documented and unambiguous, beginning with notice that the Attorney General had opened a civil and criminal inquiry into coordinated billing practices. Subpoenas followed for records tied to Judith's agency and Russell's prior distribution work. Requests narrow enough to signal focus rather than phishing. My reinstatement came in writing the same week, restoring full clearance and assigning me back to active audits without conditions. The contrast between my restored access and their expanding scrutiny felt procedural, not personal. Judith's agency announced a temporary suspension for internal review, a phrase that satisfied partners while conceding nothing, and then stopped returning calls altogether. Russell's name disappeared from vendor lists as contracts quietly lapsed, the kind of erasure that happens before anyone admits why. A colleague asked me, "Are they done?" And I said they were being read, which is how systems decide what happens next. The silence around them grew louder as it spread. Audrey's cooperation was acknowledged formally. Her documentation entered into the record with protections spelled out in writing. She told me she slept for the first time in months after submitting everything and said, "I kept thinking it would explode," which it never did. The investigation advanced through files and calendars rather than statements, a pace that rewards accuracy over urgency. Nothing moved without leaving a trace. At work, trust returned the way it always does, through repetition rather than apology. My supervisor said, "Good to have you back," and handed me a case file without ceremony. A gesture that meant more than any explanation. Miles and I fell back into our routines. The questions gone because the answers had settled into facts. What remained was not triumph but clarity. The steady knowledge that records outlast narratives and that outcomes follow the evidence when it's allowed to speak. I returned to my routines without announcing the transition, letting work reclaim its place through repetition rather than relief. The mornings settled into order again. Emails answered in sequence. Files opened and closed with purpose. The steady rhythm that makes outcomes feel earned. I did not reach for closure with Judith or Russell, because the record had already closed the loop I once thought required conversation. Peace arrived quietly, the way it does when there is nothing left to explain. Miles and I found ourselves planning ordinary things. Grocery lists and weekends that didn't revolve around contingency. One night he said, "You look lighter." And I understood he meant unburdened rather than triumphant. I learned that stability isn't the absence of conflict, but the presence of boundaries that hold. The world did not need my commentary to confirm what the files had shown. I kept working cases that mattered, reviewing claims with the same care I always had, aware that systems protect people when people protect the systems. Trust returned through consistency, not assurances, and my name carried its weight again without qualifiers. I didn't rebuild anything dramatic. I resumed what had been interrupted. The clarity that followed felt durable because it was documented. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this story and for giving it your attention. If it resonated with you, I appreciate your support and the time you spent listening. I'm grateful to share these moments and to know they land with people who value honesty and calm. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, There's another one waiting for you now.